record. Make sure I have one job and keep introducing yourself in the chat. So let us go to the next slide. Moose, who is MXGM? All right. Who is the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement? The Malcolm X Grassroots Movement is an organization of Black New Africans whose mission it is to defend the human rights of all of our people and promote self-determination as the answer to the problems that we face. We understand that the interlocking collective institutions of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism are at the root of our people's oppression, and that we understand that without the power to control our communities, determine our lives, we will continue to fall victim to genocide, the acceptable and calculated killing of part or whole of a people. And thus we fight for our power, the right to self-determination, and community control. And we're organizing all around the country around our 6 principles of unity. And this is one of the kind of ways to join the organization, one being a person of Black and New African lineage or African descent. And then you identify with the 6 principles of the organization. The first one being that we defend the human rights of all African people. That includes everybody at every intersection. That we demand reparations for the ongoing and historic oppression and genocide that our people have faced, not only here in the belly of the beast, but all around the world. We promote self-determination, and for us, that means land and independence. We oppose genocide. Again, we oppose the calculated killing and maiming and hurting of a people, ourselves and in the world. And so we stand in solidarity with all the people of Palestine and folks in Congo and the Sudan and other places fighting, standing up against genocide. And the reason that we gather today is around our principle number 5, that we demand the release of all political prisoners, prisoners of war, and political exiles. And that is the purpose and the reason of Black August. And one of our greatest principles and some of our greatest work have come from that. And then last, but certainly not least, we struggle to end gender and sexual oppression. We seek to end all forms of oppression and exploitation that our people face. Next slide. All right, so I'm gonna bring up Comrade Al to talk a little bit about what Black August is, all the way from Oakland. Free land, Comrade. Black August
Free
Resistance.
land, Black August Resistance. Thank you, Jomo. So I'm fortunate enough to be able to discuss briefly what Black August is. And this year marks 45 years of Black August resistance. Black August is a month-long commemoration to honor the fallen freedom fighters of the Black liberation movement, to call for the release of political prisoners and prisoners of war, and to educate our people on the history of the continued resistance of Black and New African and African peoples to oppression, colonization, and slavery in the United States and throughout the diaspora. A year after the assassination of Katari Gaudin by medical neglect on August 1st, 1978, the first official Black August took place in California's San Quentin prison. Black prisoners shaved their head, wore Black armbands, and in unity with the Black Muslim prisoners during Ramadan, fasted from sunrise to sunset. This set the path for the practice of fasting during Black August. During Black August, we elevate our fallen revolutionary George Jackson, his comrades, political prisoners, prisoners of war, and political exiles. To observe and commemorate Black August, everyone is encouraged to uphold the practices of study, fast, train, and fight that are laid out here. And I'm going to pass it to Lydia.
Free to land, thank you. Black August Resistance, everybody. Tonight I'm going to be reading the following article by Walter Rodney, which will be for our discussion tonight. It was written for the 1971 issue of Maji Maji, the quarterly journal of the youth wing of the Tanganyika African National Union. This is George Jackson, Black Revolutionary. You can follow along with the link that my comrade Ace has just shared in the chat. To most readers in this continent, starved of authentic information by the imperialist news agencies, the name George Jackson is either unfamiliar or just a name. The powers that be in the United States put forward the official version that George Jackson was a dangerous criminal, kept in maximum security in America's toughest jails, and still capable of killing a guard at Soledad prison. They say that he himself was killed attempting escape this year in August. Official versions given by the United States of everything from the Bay of Pigs in Cuba to the Bay of Tonkin in Vietnam have the common characteristic of stating truth on its head. George Jackson was jailed ostensibly for stealing $70. He was given a sentence of 1 year to life because he was Black, and he was kept incarcerated for years under the most dehumanizing conditions because he discovered that Blackness need not be a badge of servility, but rather could be a banner for uncompromising revolutionary struggle. He was murdered because he was doing too much to pass this attitude on to fellow prisoners. George Jackson was a political prisoner and a Black freedom fighter. He died at the hands of the enemy. Once it is made known that George Jackson was a Black revolutionary in the white man's jails, at least one point is established, since we are familiar with the fact that a significant proportion of African nationalist leaders graduated from colonialist prisons, and right now, the jails of South Africa hold captive some of the best of our brothers in that part of the continent. Furthermore, there is some considerable awareness that ever since the days of slavery, the USA is nothing but a vast prison as far as African descendants are concerned. Within this prison, Black life is cheap. So it should be no surprise that George Jackson was murdered by the San Quentin prison authorities who are responsible to America's chief prison warder, Richard Nixon. What remains is to go beyond the generalities and to understand the most significant elements attaching to George Jackson's life and death. When he was killed in August this year, George Jackson was 29 years of age and had spent the last 11 years behind bars, 7 of those in special isolation. As he himself put it, he was part of the lumpen. He was not part of the regular producer force of workers and peasants. Being cut off from the system of production, lumpen elements in the past rarely understood the society which victimized them and were not to be counted upon to take organized revolutionary steps within capitalist society. Indeed, the very term lumpen proletariat was originally intended to convey the inferiority of this sector as compared with the authentic working class. Yet, George Jackson, like Malcolm X before him, educated himself painfully behind prison bars to the point where his clear vision of historical and contemporary reality and his ability to communicate his perspective frightened the US power structure into physically liquidating him. Jackson's survival for so many years in vicious jails, his self-education, and his publication of Soledad Brother were tremendous personal achievements. And in addition, they offer an interesting insight into the revolutionary potential of the Black masses in the USA, so many of whom have been reduced to the status of lumpen. Under capitalism, the worker is exploited through the alienation of part of the product of his labor. For the African peasant, the exploitation is effected through manipulation of the price of the crops which he labored to produce. Yet, work has always been rated higher than unemployment, for the obvious reason that survival depends on the ability to obtain work. Thus, early in the history of industrialization, workers coined the slogan, "the right to work." Masses of Black people in the USA are deprived of this basic right. At best, they live in a limbo of uncertainty as casual workers, last to be hired and first to be fired. The line between the unemployed or criminals cannot be dismissed, as white lumpen in capitalist Europe were usually dismissed. The latter were considered as misfits, and regular toilers served as the vanguard. The 30-odd million Black people in the USA are not misfits. They are the most oppressed and the most threatened as far as survival is concerned. The greatness of George Jackson is that he served as a dynamic spokesman for the most wretched among the oppressed, and he was in the vanguard of the most dangerous front of the struggle. Jail is hardly an arena in which one would imagine that guerrilla warfare would take place. Yet, it is on this most disadvantaged of terrains that Blacks have displayed the guts to wage a war for dignity and freedom. In Soledad Brother, George Jackson movingly reveals the nature of this struggle as it has evolved over the last few years. Some of the more recent episodes in the struggle at San Quentin prison are worth recording. On February 27th this year, Black and brown Mexican prisoners announced the formation of a Third World Coalition. This came in the wake of such organizations as the Black Panther branch at San Quentin and the establishment of SATE, self-advancement through education. This level of mobilization of the non-white prisoners was resented and feared by white guards and some racist white prisoners. The latter formed themselves into a self-declared Nazi group, and months of violent incidents followed. Needless to say, with white authority on the side of the Nazis, Afro and Mexican brothers had a very hard time. George Jackson is not the only casualty on the side of the Blacks, but their unity was maintained, and a majority of white prisoners either refused to support the Nazis or denounced them. So even within prison walls, the first principle to be observed was unity in struggle. Once the most oppressed has taken the initiative, then they could win allies. The struggle within the jails is having wider and wider repercussions every day. Firstly, it is creating true revolutionary cadres out of more and more lumpen. This is particularly true in the jails of California, but the movement is making its impact felt everywhere, from Baltimore to Texas. Brothers inside are writing poetry, essays, and letters which strip white capitalist America naked. Like the Soledad Brothers, they have come to learn that sociology books call us antisocial and brand us criminals, when actually the criminals are in the social register. The names of those who rule America are all in the social register. Secondly, it is solidifying the Black community in a remarkable way. Petty bourgeois Blacks also feel threatened by the manic police, judges, and police officers. Black intellectuals who used to be completely alienated from any form of struggle except their personal hustle now recognize the need to ally with and take their bearings from the street forces of the Black unemployed, ghetto dwellers, and prison inmates. Thirdly, the courage of Black prisoners has elicited a response from white America. The small band of white revolutionaries has taken a positive stand. The Weathermen decried Jackson's murder by placing a few bombs in given places, and the Communist Party supported the demand by the Black prisoners and the Black Panther Party that the murder was to be investigated. On a more general note, white liberal America has been disturbed. The white liberals never like to be told that white capitalist society is too rotten to be reformed. Even the established capitalist press has come out with exposés of prison conditions, and the fascist massacres of Black prisoners at Attica Prison recently brought Senator Muskie out with a cry of enough. Fourthly, and for our purposes most significantly, the efforts of Black prisoners and Blacks in America as a whole have had international repercussions. The framed charges brought against Black Panther leaders and against Angela Davis have been denounced in many parts of the world. Committees of defense and solidarity have been formed in places as far as Havana and Leipzig. OPAAL declared August 18th as the Day of International Solidarity with Afro-Americans. And significantly, most of their propaganda for this purpose ended with a call to free all political prisoners. For more than a decade now, people's liberation movements in Vietnam, Cuba, Southern Africa, etc., have held conversations with militants and progressives in the U.S.A., pointing to the duality and respective responsibilities of struggle within the imperialist camp. The revolution in the exploited colonies and neo-colonies has as its objective the expulsion of the imperialists. The revolution in the metropolis is to transform the capitalist relations of production in their countries of their origin. Since the U.S.A. is the overlord of world imperialism, it has been common to portray any progressive movement there as operating within the belly of the beast. Inside an isolation block in Soledad or San Quentin prisons, this was not merely a figurative expression. George Jackson knew well what it meant to seek for the heightened socialist and humanist consciousness inside the belly of the white imperialist beast. International solidarity grows out of struggle in different localities. This is the truth so profoundly and simply expressed by Che Guevara when he called for the creation of 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams. It has long been recognized that the white working class in the USA is historically incapable of participating as a class in anti-imperialist struggle. White racism and America's leading role in world imperialism transformed organized labor in the US into a reactionary force. Conversely, the Black struggle is internationally significant because it unmasks the barbarous social relations of capitalism and places the enemy on the defensive on his own home ground. This is amply illustrated in the political process which involved the three Soledad brothers, George Jackson, Leda Drumgo, and John Clutchett, as well as Angela Davis and a host of other Blacks now behind prison bars in the USA. Thank you. Black August Resistance.
All right, we're gonna give some love in the chat to the comrade Lydia, who sounded just like Walter Rodney. It was like I was listening to the speech. All right, so thank you for reading, and I want to invite folks if there was a line or a phrase or something in the text that stood out or that grabbed you, inspired you, to drop it in the chat to help set the context. But I want to invite our three speakers to join us on the spotlight to discuss and kind of bring to life the essays we want to try to have a conversation with the text, with the three, but also grounded in our current time, place, and conditions. So we have joining us to discuss the essay Hiram Rivera, Musa Springer, and Charisse Burden-Stelly. And we'll bring them on. And give them some love in the chat. Yes, that's right, Jewel. It is absolutely fire. There we go. That's one. That's two. All right, here we go. So again, want to thank you all for joining us, Black August Resistance. And in this reading here, Walter Rodney is introducing George Jackson to Africa. And so wanted to use that kind of mega theme to get us into our first question. So I had the pleasure of trying to figure out which one I was going to ask to do which one to resonate, because in a way, all three of y'all can represent all three in some very powerful ways. So, but wanted to start off with Musa, and if you could, as a representative of the Walter Rodney Foundation, who has helped preserve this powerful text, if you could introduce yourself to the people and share when you first encountered Walter Rodney.
Yes, yes. Peace, y'all. Assalamu alaikum. Black August salute. Revolutionary greetings to everyone. Thank you so much to MXGM for having me and having this really important, critical conversation. And so just to start, I'll introduce myself. My name is Musa Springer. I'm a cultural worker and journalist, community organizer with the Black Alliance for Peace and Cuba's Red Barrial Afrodescendiente. Um, Lifelong learner. And I'm really honored also to be up here with my sister, Charisse Burden-Stelly, who low-key be putting me on all the time. So shout out to y'all as well as Comrade Hiram. Um, I first encountered Walter Rodney. Actually, a family member of mine gave me a copy of Groundings with My Brothers, a short, about 80-page book. It's a collection of speeches and talks and workshops that he gave in the gullies of Jamaica to the working masses in Jamaica. And I was in high school and didn't have the proper study group or guidance to really know what I was reading. I just knew I liked what I read. And then 2 years later, when I got to undergrad, I got the opportunity to meet Asha and Patricia Rodney, the daughter and wife of Walter Rodney, who live here in Atlanta and who run the Walter Rodney Foundation. And they had a class that was a unique class where students from any university in Metro Atlanta could take this class, regardless of what university you were at. The whole class was dedicated to Walter Rodney, and I said, I'm in heaven. This is phenomenal. And so I encountered Walter Rodney at a really young age when I was very hungry to make sense of the world around me, to make sense of the plight and position of African people. And it felt, even though he had written decades prior, it felt as if he was writing today for our current time when I read it. And so Rodney, Rodney to me is what Marx is for some people, is a very foundational key thinker who helps us think about revolution and socialism and the role of the African. And I did just want to also quickly remind people as well, a lot of people forget that Walter Rodney himself for a short period was a political prisoner. And so if we're talking about Black August and centering political prisoners, that's an aspect of his life. Him being targeted by the Forbes Burnham government and spending several months in prison for false charges that I do think is important to understand. And in addition, we even had the National Black Lawyers Guild, headed by Dr. Gerald Horne here in the US, went to Guyana to actually observe his trials. For lack of evidence, his trial was pushed back 3 times and then finally dismissed eventually. And so I do just wanted to uplift Walter Rodney, not just the thinker and the activist, but himself for a short period as a politically targeted prisoner as well. And I'll yield there.
All right, thank you for that, and thank you for that introduction and definitely that connection. Next, we want to turn to Charisse as one of the key communist scholar and organizer. Will you introduce yourself to the people and where you first encounter George Jackson, the Red Dragon?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all for having me here this evening. So my name is Charisse Burden-Stelly. I am a professor at Wayne State University. I teach African American Studies. I am a member of the Black Alliance for Peace, the co-coordinator of the research and archive team. I am a student of organizers and organizing. I don't know that I will call myself one. Aspiring, perhaps. In terms of where I encountered George Jackson, there's sort of 3 different nodal points. One is way back when I was an undergraduate, I was reading a book by James Baldwin called The Price of the Ticket. And in The Price of the Ticket, there's a piece called The Devil Finds Work. And in there, he compared a man named Angelo Herndon, who I write about a great deal in my book, Black Scare, Red Scare, to George Jackson. He said that Angelo Herndon was the George Jackson of his time. And so at that time, I didn't know what any of that meant, but it was something that I had taken notes on. Later on, when I was writing my dissertation and writing and thinking about Smith Act victims and communist victims as sort of the original political prisoners, right? The political prisoners in the Cold War. I was reminded of that quote. Later on, I was a TA in an ethnic studies class at UC Berkeley, and George Jackson was mentioned in the context of Black Power. And so that sort of re-sparked my interest in memory and thinking about political prisoners as knowledge producers. I worked with Robert Allen, the late Robert Allen, who was the author of this amazing work, Black Awakening in Capitalist America. He was the chair of my qualifying exams. And so I was reading a lot of political prisoners in general. So these 2 books also, I got a lot of books that I will show, but In Prison Intellectuals by Joy James and then The New Abolitionists, both of these were important to introducing me as political prisoners, as knowledge producers, and as radical thinkers. And so to make a short story long, I really came to George Jackson through study. But I will say I must credit Jared Ball and Black Liberation Media for really introducing me to Black August and really deepening my study of political prisoners and commemoration of Black August, because they really put me on. So around 2020 is really when Black August and George Jackson became a central part of like my praxis and study. So yeah.
All right, thank you for that. And then last but not least, my comrade, Hiram Rivera, longtime community organizer Y'all can't even remember a day when Hiram was a youth organizer. Can you imagine? I had to get my licks in because you was late. And also part of our work to free political prisoners, a member of Shakur Squad, the set of folks, the community organizing wing to free Dr. Matulu Shakur. Will you introduce yourself properly now that I have misintroduced you and talk about when and where you first encountered Malcolm X?
No, that was good. Uh, Free to land. Name is Hiram Rivera here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Originally from New Haven, Connecticut. Uh, like Jonathan said, longtime community organizer, director of an organization called the Community Resource Hub, co-founder of the George Jackson Organizing School, um, member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, so on and so on. Really excited and nervous to be here with Dr. CVS and Musa. So I will do my best to hang with these intellectual giants. Um, the first time I came in contact with George, the very first, well, I started doing political prisoner work when I was a teenager, around 19 years old, so specifically around the Puerto Rican political prisoners. And through that was introduced to like prison writings, political prisoners, right, and kind of heard of George. Really learned more about George when I met our comrade, who's now returned to the essence, Nahanda Abiodun in Cuba in 2003, who kind of broke it down and spoke to me about George, spoke to me about Kwesi Balagoon, those two folks specifically that I was tasked to go and research. And then through my work when I joined MXGM in 2005, the Black August work and first time engaging with Black August, being introduced to George. Then of course that the movie, the Black August movie that came out in 2007, that was kind of like whatever. But I think those are like the earliest moments that I remember where I was intentionally introduced to George Jackson and started to read Comrade George and learn more about not just George, but all of the political prisoners, right, and the prison struggle.
I'm sorry, I may have said that. I wanted you to do Malcolm. Talk about when you first met Malcolm.
Oh man, when I first met Malcolm,
Right,
woo!
right.
All
Can
right,
you
let
go
me
back
tell
that
this story
far?
real quick. Um, dog, you older than me, like by a lot. Anyway, real short story. I started high school 1991 because I'm old, and my parents moved my brother and I out to a white suburb in Connecticut because they didn't want us being Latin kings. And so, in there we encountered all kinds of racism and classism and everything you can expect living in a town that's damn near 100% white. 1992, Malcolm X, the movie came out. Shout out to Dr. Jerry Ball. I know that is like the thorn in his side, that movie. But I saw that movie and I was like, I want to be that. I don't know what this is, but I want to be that. I didn't have the language to fight back with them white kids who was calling us all kinds of niggas and jigaboos and stuff. My mom told us don't hit them white kids because they got lawyers and they're gonna send you to jail, right? And it was there that I saw. And so through that movie, I started going to meetings with the Nation of Islam, and then through there started my process of learning not just about Malcolm, but also about Black history, New African history. It was through Malcolm, it was through the Nation, it was through studying Black liberation that then led me to the Puerto Rican independence movement, right, and the Puerto Rican political prisons. And so for me, um, Brother Malcolm has always been that North Star, has always sat right at the top of the food chain because it was through him that I learned the language necessary, not only just the language, but the confidence, right, to be able to stand in the face of what we're facing at like 15, 16, 17 years old, and always leaning on that. Most of it, to be very honest, was just mimicking, right? Because I was a kid, so I wasn't reading a whole lot, but it was mimicking a lot and like quoting and literally trying to kind of like pose and stand like Malcolm. Um, but it was Malcolm that definitely sent me on this trajectory that I find myself today.
Right. Thank you for that. All right. So we want to get into some of the themes. Again, I want to encourage folks if there was uh, something from the text or a question folks have, you can use the question and answer function to raise it or drop it in the chat. And we wanted to kind of this set of questions kind of around the theme of, as he kind of writes in the essay, blackness, and as a banner of uncompromising revolutionary struggle, excuse me. And in the reading, Rodney is up to a lot. Like there's a lot going on. There's a lot of depth in the short read that it is. Dr. CBS, in the article's kind of opening paragraph, Rodney tries to help us, quote, understand the most significant elements attached to George Jackson's life and death. He does this by providing a class analysis of George. We try to put him kind of in his social status, and he does this by providing for not only George but for Malcolm, and then the kind of larger class that they emerge from, which he calls or names the Black lumpen proletariat class, as well as beginning to describe their potential pivotal role in revolutionary struggle. We talk a little bit about what is Rodney's assessment of Black class in America in 1971, and talk to us a little bit about how it's changed or how it's not 54 years later.
Sure. So I just want to start by saying, so Walter Rodney is writing about the lumpen in 1971. Around this same time in the Black Scholar, there's actually an exchange about the role of the lumpen between Eldridge Cleaver and a man named Clarence Mumford. And then in a general sense, in 1972, the November-December 1972 issue, it's called The Black Masses. And so there's a class analysis. And so this sort of interrogation of the role of the lumpen is in the milieu, like in the Black Power milieu. And this is an important debate because, you know, in orthodox or classical Marxist theory, the lumpen proletariat is a sort of throwaway class, right? But part of what Rodney is gesturing toward, as well as Eldridge Cleaver, Mumford pushes back on this, is that the lumpen is a potential revolutionary force, not unlike how Fanon understands the peasantry in Africa. Of course, Cabral has a critique of Fanon, right? Saying that the peasants are not objectively revolutionary, but they are potentially so because of the way that they're incorporated or not in colonial society. And I think that Walter Rodney is making a similar type of argument. He is not saying that the lumpen proletariat is objectively revolutionary. What he is saying is that the material conditions of incarceration and imprisonment, and what George Jackson would name fascism, is what develops the consciousness of the lumpen proletariat. And so they're not a throwaway class. They are potentially revolutionary, but if they don't come to this consciousness, then they can become counter-revolutionary. I think the second important thing that Rodney brings up is the petty bourgeoisie, right? And the intellectuals, and that in radical, in certain historical moments, the petty bourgeoisie is going to follow the revolutionary currents. But they're always historically a mercurial or a iffy class. They can go either way. And this is because of the nature of the Black petty bourgeoisie. It's a contingent, dependent, and managerial force. And so I think that that's important as well. And this relates to statements. He talks about the intellectuals in the same fashion as well. And this relates to a statement Walter Rodney makes elsewhere about intellectuals or academics being enemies of the people until proven otherwise, right? And so he has essentially a similar assessment of the potential but unsure nature of the petty bourgeoisie as well as the lumpen proletariat. The last thing that I will say is that about sort of that moment is part of what he's gesturing towards. So people like to think that Marxism-Leninism is some European white people shit. But what he points to is that it is Black workers in the Black lumpen potentially that stretch Marxism, to use Fanon's term, that actually are expanding on and making it relevant to revolutionary struggle. With respect to Black class dynamics today, I think that's something that we have to interrogate is what we might call the sub-proletariat. So these people, they are workers, but the way that Black people have historically been incorporated into U.S. political economy, I'll just use that as an example, is as a sub-proletariat. And so this concept comes from a man called Harold barren. But recently, one of my great friends, Gus Wood, just came out with a book called Class Warfare in Black Atlanta, where he develops this concept of the subproletariat. I did in my book, but I'm not just going to keep on referencing my book, even though I think it's good. So I think we need to think about what is the nature of work and what are some class categories that we need to interrogate in this historical moment based on changes in the capitalist mode of production and based on what that then means for organizing and for revolutionary struggle. As we know, and how, as we have known as Black people historically, the white male factory worker is not the quintessential revolutionary subject, right? It is toilers, it is other types of racialized and colonized workers that actually are the drivers of the revolution. And of course, this is the sort of pivot that happened in the 60s and 70s as socialism as a revolutionary force shifted to the global south, to places like Vietnam and Cuba. And so I think that that's one thing that we need to be mindful of, is that if we're thinking about interracial solidarity, we have to understand that Black workers are actually a different class than white workers. They are a subproletariat, and that means something in terms of the ways that racialization and economic exploitation work together. I think the final thing that I'll say is and I think we also need to be mindful of the Black petty bourgeoisie and that sort of contradictory character and the ways that Black petty bourgeois sensibility has infused organizing spaces, right? If only aspirationally, if only in terms of the culture, and how that has put us in the quagmire that we're in currently, whereby we can't bust a grape in a fruit fight, right? Like we've not been able to stop, for example, genocide in Palestine, nor the authoritarian occupation that is taking place in DC. And this has to do with the ways that I think a particular type of professionalization or petty bourgeois sensibility has crowded out the revolutionary potential of the Black masses and has become the sort of way that we understand how organizing happens. And so those are the things I think we need to be thinking about and interrogating. And Black class is really important. We cannot adopt a mainstream class analysis onto Black people because we have a very particular historical development in terms of class and social stratification.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Absolutely. Yeah, I can that's been some of my lived experience as an organizer. I think Hiram has a whole podcast rant on the kind of the elite capture of movements through nonprofits, the culture that it kind of generates, and the kind of, like you said, the inability to even win policy, if you will, as if, right, even to push paper. I want to turn to Hiram and get into kind of the second theme where Rodney describes jail as this kind of rather paradoxical or contradictory place where one could, quote, hardly imagine guerrilla warfare would take place. But it's also the place where the true revolutionary cadres are being formed who had the guts to wage a war for dignity and freedom. When we talk about what is this war that connects George, Malcolm, and Rodney as warriors across space and time, and talk to us a little bit about where you see it or how it is being waged today.
Yeah. I'll try to be as concise as possible, but Jonathan, let me, you know what I'm saying, if I'm going over, definitely cut me off or let me know. Really quickly, I think it starts with the Mayafa, right? It starts with the African Holocaust and the African slave trade and the war that was enacted on the continent of Africa that stole some of Africa's most precious resources, her people being, right, the most precious, but continues to steal and rob the continent of his resources, and ultimately built the West, right, is what built the West. And so, you know, tip of the spear, or Soledad Burton's tip of the spear has a quote in there that says that enslaved Africans always saw slavery as an act of war, right? And there is one person that he quotes in particular, Aluda Aquino, who says, when you make men slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. Right. And so this understanding that what we understand as the United States, right, has always been at war against Black people and the Black nation. War comes up again when we're talking about the issue of like Buffalo Soldiers and the conquering of the West and the creation of the United States, right? And the use of military service as a pathway to citizenship for those Black people, enslaved Black folks or freed Black folks at that time, which you also see happening with immigrant populations today, but how the U.S. has always used its military service as a way to, fool folks into thinking it's a pathway to citizenship and engaging in empire building, whether they wanted to consciously or not. The Civil War is another point in time where war really impacts Black folks, because that Civil War fundamentally not only changed the economic system of the United States, but then fundamentally changed and transformed the Black nation itself and new African identity, right? Itself, moving from slavery to colonial subjects. And so when you had the Sherman Special Order 15 that was calling for the redistribution of land post emancipation, right? And that was going to give all this land. This is where you get the 40 acres and the mule stuff from, for folks that started to allow for the imagination, liberatory imagination of Black people. Then with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, that is revoked. And Black people then are brought under the jurisdiction of the states that they live in following the 14th Amendment, right? Therefore, removing any kind of imaginations or pathways of liberatory, right? National liberation within this continental United States. And so with the 13th Amendment also following that, then are re-enslaved, or as Queen Mother Moore put it, right, recaptured in this prison system. And so at the time, the prisons were primarily white folks who were kind of like couldn't pay their debts or the kind of BS, right? But then it's filled with Black bodies. And we understand that prisons serve this point of, one, crushing resistance, of kind of like counterinsurgency, but also as a revenue generator, right? Through the forced labor that continues to happen today. And so when you're thinking of this war, this constant war that is happening, shaping the new African nation in this country, it is what ties all Black revolutionaries all the way from the first time we landed on these boats, all the way to 1804 in Haiti, all the way to Omaha, Nebraska, right, where Malcolm is born, and all this. And so that incarceration, to bring it, to what you're talking about, that state of war that recaptures our people, that re-enslaves our people, that, as Osama Burn again says, that these are institutions of low intensity warfare, right, that present themselves as apolitical institutions fighting criminality. We know that's not true. That what they were doing were trying to remove all of those insurgent, rebellious Black folks who did not want to be broken and who could not be broken, right, and threw them into prison. It's inside of these prisons where we would find a lot of our former political prisoners and political prisoners, a lot of these rebels who then, right, Dhoruba bin Wahad talks about this all the time, who were teaching other prisoners behind the walls, right, and connecting the dots for them, why the system that ultimately put them on this trajectory to land where they were, right, who put them in these positions where they were going to suffer the consequences of poverty, suffer the consequences of capitalism and white supremacy, fall into these situations where so many of our people have to take desperate actions to survive, which are then criminalized under the law, which we understand, right, white folks and the police make and remake on the spot, right, and then house our people. But then what ended up happening was it became a training ground. And so when you have folks like Malcolm, when you have folks like George, when you have folks like Ho Chi Minh, right, in Vietnam, who understood that it is inside of these cages where these potential revolutionaries, like Dr. CBS was talking about, right, who were once considered lumpen or considered castaways or whatever, but who do have the potential to become revolutionaries, come face to face, right, with the blunt repression of the state, the very reality of what the state is. It is there this transformation starts to happen, and they become these dragons, right? And the quote that when the prison doors open up, the real dragon comes out, right? That what George would say, transforming the Black criminal mentality into a Black revolutionary mentality. This is where Malcolm, right, has his eyes opened up, and he talks about the vision of seeing the messenger, right, come before him and all that. But it is in these institutions that these brothers who, when we learn about them and read about them, are told that they're self-taught, that they taught themselves, that they read everything, and they're just kind of just these brilliant geniuses. But in fact, they weren't. They were part of collectives. They were held by other prisoners. There was groups that were created, organizations behind the walls created with the purpose of educating, training each other to fight this war that they saw very clearly because they were living it each and every day. This is where Osami argues that then the prison system starts to transform itself again, right, with all the reforms and all the programs to kind of break up that revolutionary training. So it is that war that started, that brought us here in the first place. It is that war that put us in the conditions that we are in historically. It is that war that built this empire and built, right, the what we understand, understands the political West, right? The war against Black people, the war against Black bodies, right? That upholds this whole thing and the purpose of crushing any imagination, liberatory imaginations that our people can have. So what does that look like? Well, when we look at George, right, in particular, who saw the prison struggle at that time as a part of the decolonial struggle of that era. So we're talking about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and you're talking about the whole not the whole, but a good portion of the colonial world is fighting against, is decolonizing itself and engaging in these wars. Then they understood that their prison struggle inside the belly of the beast, inside the belly of the beast, which are its prisons, right, was their side of struggle. That in this warfare, the prison, the courts, the jails, all these other institutions in this capitalist system were just different fronts of one war, right? A war that's being waged against Black people, but then also poor people, and non-white people alike. And therefore, as Fanon would say, the only way that this beast, this level of violence is going to cease is when it's confronted with a greater violence. That we came in through violence, and the only way out of this blood-clad Babylon, right, is through violence. And so what it became was a training ground because they were there, and more easily they were face to face every day with the beast. They couldn't be bought with electoral slogans. They couldn't be bought with music videos. They couldn't be bought with sports games and jewelry and all kinds of things. They lived every single day inside of the beast of the beast, the belly of that beast, right? And so what does that look like today? That war continues today. The war on Africa continues nonstop. We know that with Congo, Sudan, and every other country. We see those decolonial struggles happening in the Sahel, right? Where folks are still fighting these decolonial wars. We see it with the inventions of cop cities in this country, preparing for an inevitable war that is going to have to come, right? Capitalism is unstable. Capitalism does not have the means nor the desire to meet the needs of everyday people. And so at some point, there's going to have to be a confrontation, right? And that confrontation is coming, and this system knows it. And so it builds its cop cities. It's creating these mechanisms. It's starting to get us to be okay with genocide, be okay with the kidnapping of people, be okay with cops and tanks and the police and the military basically looking exactly the same, and we can't tell which one is which. And now blurring the lines between federal agents, local police departments, and probably, you know what I'm saying, deputized white nationalist vigilantes, right? In preparation of this war that is coming. Because what they want to do is make this whole thing Palestine. As their numbers continue to drop and drop because they're not having as many babies, right? And as our numbers continue to grow, there will be a situation where this is not a white majority country anymore. But what we are taught through Fanon, through Cesar, through all these folk, Rodney, right, is that the colonial occupier is not just going to leave. He's not just going to hand over the keys to the mansion to you, right? And what they will do is then try to make this much more of an apartheid state, which what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. now. The colonial boom, the imperial boomerang, right? What happens out there in the testing grounds in the colonial world and the periphery of the empire is eventually going to come back here. And so now what we see with the checkpoints and the violence and the policing in Gaza and other parts of the world, we're now seeing it in Washington, D.C., right? And to Dr. Burden-Stelly's point, we don't have the mechanisms or the apparatuses or the organizations capable of defending us against that, right? We have lost that capacity with the war through excuse me, COINTELPRO and state violence against our organizations, the Panthers, the BLA, the Revolutionary Action Movement, and all those in the 70s and through the 80s. And then the mental war, and you talk about this, Jonathan, all the time, the mental side that happens to our people of erasing certain histories, of right, filling our minds with all kinds of other stuff and distractions, creating a nonprofit industrial complex that has replaced and taken the role of those independent political organizations, right, that were offering an alternative. And to be very clear, it was a Marxist alternative, it was a socialist alternative that George believed in, that Malcolm was moving closer towards, right? Because they understood that we are facing is a global capitalist system and is going to take an international, right, alternative, which was Marxism, right, to beat that. And so to wrap it up, what we're seeing now is that war being back unleashed again very openly in Washington, D.C., under the guise of fighting crime. But when they talk about what are the crimes that these people are committing, it's young people hanging out in groups, it's dirt bikes and four-wheelers in the streets. And so who is that? Who are you talking about? Right? You are occupying formerly Chocolate City, again, creating checkpoints, creating all this violence, again, deputizing white nationalists, which is how the police force was invented in the first place, right? To enact that state of war on us before we can develop the capacities to be able to fight back and bust those grapes that Dr. CBS was saying, because that's the only way we're going to get this out. George said it, Malcolm said it, Queen Mother said it, everyone has said it. There is no way around that. We need to build the organizations with the capacity to inflict a certain level of consequence on our colonial masters before it's too late and they put us all back on those plantations or bury us in the ground.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you for that. I did give you a tough question as I was like, man, I asked you to summarize probably a century worth of struggle.
And you also made me follow Dr. CBS. So
Yeah, you're absolutely yes, the perpetual, the ongoing war, and yeah, absolutely seeing the boomerang. Um, that's now happening in DC where I'm headed back to, right? And absolutely, we're in question. I'm in question around our capacity to really to kind of through kind of sets of years of organizing, right? And yeah, there's a tie there to this kind of black class thing, right? While we've been out doing the fan dance, right? They've been preparing the furnace for us, right? And so now we're find ourselves once again back on our heels as this surge happens, right? And it is kind of what is gonna shift the conditions, the ground for us to lean us forward and be ready to really move. And in that, Hiram, we kind of talking about international solidarity, and that kind of brings us to the last question for this particular round, and to you, Musa, around the reading's final paragraph. Almost shadows kind of where Hiram was going, where he talks about international solidarity grows out of different localities. And throughout the piece, he tries to relate African struggles to those Africans in America who live in the belly of the beast, as well as other people's liberation movements to aim to expel the imperialist camp, right? We talk about where are the places where international solidarity is flourishing today, and where do we need to sow some seeds of international struggle?
Yeah, and well, I have to follow up Hiram, so it's a chain of command around here. No, I'm just joking. So I think there's a very striking line in Rodney's piece where he says, ever since the days of slavery, the USA is nothing but a vast prison as far as African descendants are concerned. Within this prison, black life is cheap. And so I'm going to answer this in sort of two parts. First is just to give a little bit of like history for the long arc of this war that Hiram was talking about, and then how it leads us to our international capacities today that we have to rebuild. Rodney, like this piece is probably his most popular when he's talking about prisons, but the prisons, policing, and criminalization is a reoccurring theme in all of his works. Even going back to his very first book, The History of the Upper Guinea Coast, he talks about how in the Guinea Coast, the Portuguese colonizers, literally, and slave traders introduced legal, laws that never existed before for the sake of creating a criminal class among the Mande people and others. And so he has a line where he says, at one point, to fall off of a palm tree was a crime punishable by being sold into slavery, to accidentally fall off of a palm tree. He talks about how something like adultery went from being sort of a cultural faux pas to now being a crime punishable by being sold into slavery. And then more importantly, he talks about sort of prisons as actually a colonial technique, which Hiram was also kind of getting at. And so he talks about how it was the Portuguese who built the very first prisons in the western coast of Africa. It was the Dutch and then later the British who built the four oldest prisons in Guyana. It was the direct descendants of British colonizers who built Parchman Prison in Mississippi. Originally, it was a parchment farm that was developed from a plantation into a formal prison. And so we can't talk about international solidarity without first understanding the international nature of prisons themselves as a colonial technique, right? Like we that has to kind of be the basis of how we move forward. I recommend everyone read the history of the Upper Guinea Coast. Um, and then two, thinking about international solidarity and this question of sort of where are the places that we should be looking towards struggling, where should we be rebuilding solidarity? Because it is Black August, I really want us to highlight and think about Cuba as perhaps paradoxical and dialectical. On one hand, it is a open air prison due to the U.S. blockade for 65 years now. Cuba operates as an open air prison where import of food, medicine, and travel is all restricted, right, due to the U.S. blockade. That's sort of the primary contradiction. But on the flip side of that, Cuba, when we're thinking through this war on Africans and we're thinking through not just political prisoners, but prisoners of war of our people, Cuba has been a home of refuge for many, many, many of people who we need to uplift. Earlier, Hiram mentioned Nahanda, for example. Nahanda lived out her days, her final days and years in Cuba. But also, there's more popular examples, right? We have Assata Shakur, who escaped prison and arrived in Cuba. We have Robert F. Williams from 1961, who arrived in Cuba and spent several years there with the support of the Castro government. We also have other colonized, groups like Puerto Rican nationalists, right, or the Boricua Popular Army. Some of them who were hand-in-hand comrades with many of our Panther elders and our BLA elders, who themselves would find refuge in Cuba. And then, of course, we have many others I could name. And by that same measure, the U.S. has its own legacy of politically imprisoning Cubans here in the U.S. as well, right? There was the Cuban Five, very notably, and others. And so when we think about Cuba, it becomes this space of refuge, right? And the Panthers were not able to just randomly show up in Cuba and say, "Here I am." They had built up some capacity, some organizational, some productive capacity. They had a level of standing internationally, right, that allowed them to have institutional diplomatic ties between someone like a Fidel Castro. You had someone like a Robert F. Williams able to literally correspond with Chinese revolutionaries and so forth. You had the Cleavers who would eventually go to the DPRK who were directly corresponding with Kim Il-sung prior to going to Cuba. And so what this small island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida provided was a literal refuge, but also a theoretical and symbolic refuge for the plight of the African revolutionary. And so, this island endeavored on an African revolution essentially and installed through this African revolution socialism. So that is not something that's tangible or that's not of the past. That's something that's tangible today, right? And so by letting down the Cuban struggle, as I feel many have nowadays, we've actually let down ourselves and our own capacity to build these connections. On a really basic, fundamental level as organizers, there's no reason why all of us are not every single year with a group of high school seniors trying to convince them to go receive free medical care in Cuba, for example, right? Um, and so on that front, I think that that is a terrain of struggle that we have to set our sights on and the more we can build our organizational capacity, in fact, the more that the opportunity for solidarity to become material and tangible in these ways I've named grows and flourishes. I also think we have the example that perhaps a Walter Rodney, a George Jackson, a Malcolm X would be marveling at right now in the AES, in the Sahel, where we have three African nations who have formed a Pan-African confederation, right? And are openly and explicit about their development towards eradicating the colonizers. Um, so we have places where this is flourishing, but it comes back to our own productive capacities within our own movements, right? Not just being sort of obscure circles of a left who speak to people who already agree with us, but actually attaching ourselves to the masses in such a way that it does build our capacity for labor, it builds our capacity for skills, it builds our capacity for diplomacy and so forth, right? Thinking of ourselves as the nation that we are requires organizing as a nation. And then, therefore, that is the source from which international solidarity can only come from, right? Nations only interact with other nations at the end of the day. And so, because we had this basis and then we had a war against us, an ongoing long war that heightened and intensified and developed with what we now know as the COINTELPRO operation, but of course was much more expansive than that. We have to really focus our attention on rebuilding this kind of capacity to not just be in solidarity and statements written on Instagram posts, but to actually have some kind of capacity to offer to others and then to receive as well, right? And so I'll stop there, a little rambling, but free Cuba in the blockade.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely feel that. Well, I feel like the day when our best statement is some action. That's the day, right? Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. So, want to encourage folks to ask questions in the chat. I see we have two, and just kind of this last set of questions. I have three. I think maybe we'll get to two with the time that we have, and this is open for any one of you all to answer or to be in conversation around. Um, the first one is around kind of Black August and kind of supposes that Black August is a reflection of George Jackson and this idea of a dragon, who, according to Rodney, again from the article, knew well what it meant to seek heightened socialist and humanistic consciousness inside the belly of the white imperialist beast. So my question is, will one or multiple of you all talk about how this consciousness is fostered by the by Black August and its practices of study, fasting, training, and fighting?
I mean, I just want to quickly note the importance of study. So, my esteemed panelists, Hiram and Musa, graciously lavished me with whatever, but these degrees don't mean shit. You see the importance of study, right? And commitment to the people is like the basis for knowledge, not being an academic, not having a PhD. And I think that, my comrades here convey that study is important. It is for everybody. It is the responsibility of everybody to study. And I think that something that's really important about Black August is the discipline aspect. I think discipline is something that we're sorely lacking in many ways, right? And I think the lack of discipline is encouraged. I think alienation and apathy and individualism, adventurism, these are the things that are encouraged to thwart a disciplined approach to organizing and to anything really. And so the commemoration of Black August and engaging in the practice of study, fasting, training, and fighting, I think is a time to recommit ourselves to our historical task and like what is actually to be done. Like we have to study, but we can't just study. We also have to fight, right? And there's a Fred Hampton quote that everybody knows, I'm sure, about theory devoid of action and action devoid of theory. Cabral also has this quote to that end. In terms of fasting, I think that especially in a time where hyper consumerism, gluttony, right? These types of things are what we're saturated with day to day. Fasting, right, as another form of discipline and as another way of engaging with our bodies and our health is really important. And then training. So training and study go together. But to me, training also means sort of engaging in something in a protracted and committed and rigorous way. And I think these are all just fundamental skills that we need in struggle. And if we do not develop those skills, right? Like we're often looking at what's out there, like what needs to happen in the revolution out there, but we have to transform ourselves into revolutionary subjects. We have to develop revolutionary ethics and a particular revolutionary way of understanding the world. And those things come through these tenets of Black August, which are study, fight, train, and fast.
The one thing I'll say is, in Blood in My Eye, there's a chapter there. They're not really chapters, but a chapter there called Letter to My Comrade, where George lays this out, right, really quickly, succinctly. And he's talking about specifically the study of Marxism, right? And through the study of Marxism and engaging with brothers, but basically engaging with folks in the street, folks who are struggling every day, right, to move our people from a riot stage to socialism, to move from these kind of like uh, spontaneous uprisings and move it to a coordinated, right, alternative capitalism, a coordinated fight. And it was that study of Marxism and scientific socialism that allowed George to be able to analyze the system as a whole and to identify all of the points, the economic, social, political forces at play that, again, not only put his community, his nation, his people, himself in the predicaments and situations that he found himself, but also why prisons had to exist, why slavery had to exist, why the police repression has to exist against Black people in order for this country to be the country that it is and be the empire that it is. And through that study is where he concluded that fascism was the ruling politic of this country. He says in 1970, right, in 1971, that fascism is already here. And because as the politic of the country, then it is the duty of all people inside and outside of the walls to prepare ideologically and physically for a confrontation with the state, right? That Revolutionary War was the only option that was available to, based off his analysis and his assessment of all of those forces and the conditions and all of the uh, all the stuff that's coming up, right? The confrontations and the contradictions, right, that arise every day that ultimately put us on this path of confrontation. And so the study and the training is very specific, right? It's a study of Marxist science to be able to analyze and understand the systems and what we're dealing with, and then to train for an inevitable fight that has to happen with, like Dr. CBS, with the fasting. It's a sacrifice, right? And to sacrifice for people and to be prepared and comfortable with sacrifice, that Malcolm also talks about, that if you're not ready to make the ultimate sacrifice, then stop talking about revolution. You can't talk about revolutionary this and that if you are not prepared to make that ultimate sacrifice and go through whatever consequence may come as a result.
Yeah.
I would just briefly add, I think, Hiram, you hit the nail on the head. What we have to do and what these four tenets of Black August force us to think about is not merely developing politically, but developing ideologically, right? If we're looking at today's current conditions, we have on one side a nonprofit industrial complex teaching us that to organize and do activism devoid of ideology, allegedly, is the correct solution. And then on the other hand, we have ideological confusion. We have people saying that they are not African, they are Sulani, they are natives, whatever, right? We have ideological, which is sort of a foundational error. So what Rodney, Malcolm, and George, when you go and read what they were reading and you read the list of what they were reading, they weren't necessarily strictly reading politics. They were reading ideologically developing works like Marx, right? Like Fanon. All three of them said that the US and the West, the colonial world, is constitutively fascist, right? That it is the chickens coming home to roost, right? That's what literally all three of them echo each other in saying that. And so it's because they had developed themselves ideologically. And if you have an ideological development, then the fasting, training, and fighting portions of that are the logical outflows from a revolutionary ideology. And then the quick thing also is that when we think of training and fighting, we have to throw a lot of the rest is revolutionary, self-care for liberation, go buy your $8 bath bomb to honor Black August. Like, we have to throw a lot of that stuff. There might be kids on here. A lot of that stuff needs to be thrown out the window. If we are truly believing our own analysis, to steal Charisse's words, and you believe the U.S. is fascist, you need to be able to fight or run from those fascists at some point. You choose, right? Your own organizational capacity should decide that for you. But so we actually do have to get in the gym, go for some walks, do some yoga, whatever it might be. There actually is a pretty fundamental, practical, physical element too within everyone's capabilities that we can't just sort of ignore for the study groups as well, right? You have a study group, but why don't you also form an exercise group or a training or some combat training? I mean, that is extremely practical, but it goes against sort of everything that the capitalist liberal democracy has been throwing at us the last 20 years, and I don't think that's unintentional.
All right. Thank you for those responses. All right. In that time, folks have started to fill up the chat box, the question and answer, as well as the chat box view. So I think we have about 5 questions, kind of four here.
Real quick, Jomo, I just want to say, following what Musa just said, right? Reminding folks that Black August is a communal
Yeah.
thing. Right?
Yeah.
Black August is not an individual. Black August was created as a communal thing with the Black Guerrilla family and in all the prisons, right? But everything is done communally, going back to the traditional ways of our people, going back to the system that nothing is going to be done individually, right? That everything inside of Black August is to be done communally because that fight is going to be done communally and take all of us together.
Right. That's what Sada says. You can't get free, can't get liberated without community. All right, let's look at the first question. I'll just kind of go in order. This is it's a question around kind of an update around the class analysis piece, and it feels like this is to you, Dr. CBS, around that the question is, I'd like to hear a little more about how the status of the petty bourgeoisie as a cogent and managerial makes them mercurial or apt to be against the revolution. Also, what kinds of things determine whether the lumpen do come into consciousness? What do we need to do to make everyone come to consciousness when it comes together to form revolution?
So just quickly, I think so. Harold Cruz is a good person actually to read about Black class formation. There's a lot about, and Harold Cruz is not my favorite, but I think that part of the reason why, not I think, what he argues and what I tend to believe is part of the reason that the Black petty bourgeoisie is so reactionary is because of its dependent and contingent nature. And it primarily serves a managerial function because Black people own no means of production, right? And so most of the way that the Black petty bourgeois operates is through services, initially to the Black community, but there's also a segment that has historically developed in service to the white community. And what this means is that so much of the Black petty bourgeois class positioning is cultural capital, because historically it has not equated to the types of income or wealth that the dominant petty bourgeoisie has been able to accumulate. So a lot of it has to do with access and privilege. That determines who the Black petty bourgeoisie is going to align with. Are they going to align with the tiny Black sort of bourgeoisie, or the mainstream bourgeoisie, or with the Black majority, which is, workers and lumpen? And it is not a settled question, right? And this is where concepts like class suicide come into play. So class suicide means that you are willing to cast off the relative privileges and accoutrements of where you're positioned in order to fully identify with and be in community and in struggle with working people. There's a concept called Schadenfreude that I often talk about, but essentially, another reason why the Black petty bourgeoisie has a propensity to be reactionary is because, again, their ability to accumulate and their class position is very, very precarious, right? They're one or two paychecks away from just being a Black worker. And so oftentimes this is where you see Black support for police, right? Black support for particular types of militarism and imperialism, because this group is trying to protect itself as much as possible from being confused with like those blacks, right? Those blacks over there who actually are deserving of the punishment that they get, but I'm not, right? Because I've achieved this or I have access to this. And so in terms of the lumpen, well, you know, as Rodney points out, the way that Malcolm X and George Jackson and others came to consciousness is one through the savage conditions of the prisons that were completely intolerable, two through collective action and study, but not just study, putting that study into practice, right? So fundamentally changing the way that they saw the world and the way that they saw their relationship to each other and to struggle. And without that study, without that connection, and without the sort of realization that the world that we live in is fundamentally inhuman, it is very difficult to come to consciousness. And that is true irrespective of one's class position. And so to me, it is, and I think this is true, right? That class suicide is hard to ask today, because of, right, people, you know, like I said, people can't even afford to pay attention, right? And so it's very, very, people think that somehow they're protected from suffering by holding on to the class position. But in fact, if one relinquishes that fantasy, right, one finds that there is much more possibility, or there's much more realism in letting that go, because it's all completely reversible. Look around you, right? Look at what's happening to these professionals. So that the attack on the federal, like, this is the last thing I'll say, the attack on the federal government is not happenstance. Historically, the way that the Black bourgeoisie has been able to accumulate is through federal work, like the post office, right? And the fact that the federal government is being cut is a attack not only on the public in general, but on Black people in particular. And so all of this accumulation that has been allowed, like, these things are reversible, they're temporary, and they're meant, you know, they're articulated to where we are in a particular stage of production. So anyway, hopefully that answered your question. I could go on and on about class, but
Absolutely. I think you also maybe got to the question around anonymous attendees. Should we see these Black folks upholding these values as race and class traders? And it feels like it can depend on time, place, and condition. I think Hiram's answer is absolutely yes. Get the shovel. We've had that discussion before. We got a lot of questions in there and we are running out of time. I saw two questions around that I see a lot oftentimes when we talk about freeing the land, and that is the question of indigenous folks and creating nation states that we see replicate. And I just want to always draw us back that the root of our nationalism is different than the root of the nationalism that we see in settler colonialism. Particularly in the New African Independence Movement, I'll point folks to the roots of the New African Independence Movement written by Chokwe Lumumba, one of the co-founders of the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And it clearly states in that though we claim the territory as our homeland, we understand and accept that our claim to land will not supersede that of the indigenous nations, and that we in fact understand that we are one of many captured nations inside the belly of the beast, and it will require the freedom of all of them to do that, and there's enough space for us all. I also reference folks to the latest Rebuild article that really also breaks it down, where it almost like we could fit all of us in Mississippi if we needed to, right? So
yeah, I just dropped the link to the Rebuild edition, the theoretical special theoretical edition there that everyone should check out. There's a long form article that speaks specifically to this issue and also breaks down what New African communism is.
Absolutely. So check that out. And I think we'll pause it there. I want to then close this out with you all come one more round, and to talk about George Jackson, Walter Rodney, and Malcolm X. What is their call to action for us today? Hiram, start us off. We'll go Hiram, Musa, and then Dr. Seabass, you'll close us out.
I think it's the theme of the night: get organized, join independent political organizations, right? If you don't have them, build them and study, right? Study, and not just study random stuff, but study socialism, Marxism, scientific socialism, so you'll be able to assess, right, all the forces at play that are creating the conditions that that we're living under. Get organized, and build the capacity to fight back because our lives depend on it.
Yeah, followed up with the same thing. Organize, organize, organize. All three of these legendary giants were members of political organizations and formations that grew them, and they grew alongside these organizations as well. Don't be afraid to take the revolutionary action and make the revolutionary choices, whether that is class suicide or other endeavors. None of these men were afraid to do such. And I'm gonna pass it.
Like I would just frame the question slightly differently. Like, what is our responsibility to these ancestors and to each other? Like, I don't like to ventriloquize dead people. Number one, we don't know what their politics would be like today. We've seen far too many people. I don't want to put that on Walter Rodney, any of these people, right? But we never know. Look at Cleveland, right? And so I think that to me, it's like, what is our call to each other? What is our responsibility to each other? How do we take information from webinars like this and apply them and practice them? Because we need to look to each other. Black people we're the only race that needs leaders. I do not like it is imposed upon us as if we are, without leaders, we're incapable. I do not believe that to be true. I think that we need to look more and more to each other, to talk to our neighbors, to talk to ordinary people who have no power, privilege, prestige, or notoriety. Like regular people, it's regular ass people who are going to get us out of this mess if we hope to get out of it. Organized people, inform people with ideological clarity. And so I think that look to your neighbors, stop looking to celebrities, stop looking to influencers, like look to your neighbors, look to your comrades. We are all that we have. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that adjustment. I love that, right? What is our responsibility to them today? And absolutely, get off the gram, get into the streets. And actually, we're going to give you some marching orders. So we want to thank again our panelists. We could give them some love in the chat. Again, it will be up on our YouTube. And I want to bring my comrade Al back on to talk about joining MXGM and some actions that we can take to fight to free our political prisoners. Free to land.
You on mute, brother.
Oh, thank you. Black August Resistance, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. This has been a wonderful conversation. And as Jomo said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing right now to continue to hit on these commitments that we discussed. So first, we're going to call people to organize with the campaigns to free Baba Kamal Siddiqui, to free Imam Jamil Al-Amin, and to bring Mamiya home, and to free Shaka Shakur. So you can join these freedom campaigns, and we're asking people to make the demands to free our comrades and elders, part of your existing movement work, and bring in new organizations into the fight and pressure the local, state, and federal prison systems to release our political prisoners. We also know that as struggles and movements grow and escalate, the state creates more political prisoners. We are actively witnessing the criminalization, abuse, and capture of young people and organizers during rebellions like Reverend Joy Powell, Josh Williams, and the struggle to stop Cop City. We must free our revolutionary elders, free our comrades captured by the state, and free them all. So you can plug in and commemorate 45 years of Black August resistance by fighting for the freedom of all political prisoners. The link should be in the chat, and you can still obviously plug into MXGM and our movements in a lot of different ways to stay engaged. I'll pass back to Jomo.
All right, next slide. And again, we want to thank you all for joining us today for our weekly series for Black August 2025. And next week, at the same time, we will have Black Against the Empire. So get your bay, Black Against the Empire. See what I did there? Opposing genocide from Attica to Haiti, Palestine, and beyond. And we will have a credible panelist who was mentioned here, Dr. Asami Burton, as well as Pierre La Bocero, I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name, from the Haitian Action Committee, Black feminist organizer, author, and filmmaker, Charlene Carruthers, an organizer, revolutionary educator, and executive director of Rethink New Orleans, Karen Marshall. You don't want to miss it. And with that, we have completed our program for this evening. Again, we want to thank our panelists. Thank you. Thank the people. Thank you to George, Rodney, and Malcolm. And we say free to land, Black August resistance by any means necessary.
Peace.